Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.
We have come over a way with tears that have been watered. We have come treading our way through the blood of the slaughtered. Chapter 7. The Scattering of the People, Routes to Death and Reconstruction. The African migrations have been stressed at various points as one of the major developments from which so much can be learned about the history of the black people. The migrations explain many things. They were people in perpetual movements. The movements were human tragedies spanning too many millenniums. For it was noted that the great pressures on the Africans actually began in prehistoric times, and that the pressures that uprooted so many settled communities came from two principal agents of destruction: the slow and relentless incursions of oceans and sand and the slow relentless incursions of Asian hordes. The Europeans, coming later, accelerated the movements. Migrations as culture decline. The migrations were of many different kinds, and so much that the overall description of them is often misleading. There was no general continuous flight of the people, here and there all over the continent. Some of the movements were so slow and limited in space that one might hesitate to call them migrations. These were the groups that moved only a relatively short distance each time and, as a whole, never left their general area. After 100 years, such groups might not be more than 100 miles from their traditional home after several generations. Even in the cases of those who migrated farthest, the movement had been slow because the whole movement was forced, every breakup a painful uprooting of communities that had been built on hopes and dreams of a permanent abode. Every move was a search for still another abode where land and water could support life and security could assure another chance of survival. These slow-moving migrations were mentioned in the discussion of geographical influences. There were also the better-known migrations that erupted and moved south, east, and west like tidal waves. These occurred as the result of many Asian and European invasions and conquests. They were further accelerated by the new turn in the institution of slavery from the 7th century AD onward. At a much later period, after the 16th century, black marauding groups such as the Jaga and the Ngoni added to the turmoil and disorganization. It is quite clear that the waves of blacks that spread over Africa in these migrations came mainly from the area where black concentration was greatest, and the attacks on that concentration persevered relentlessly. This area of black concentration of population was the ancient Ethiopian Empire, which I have described as the heartland of the race, its motherland with a civilization that, despite the Asian invasions, still included all of Upper Egypt in 3100 BC and extended southward over the Sudan across Abyssinia. But everywhere the people from the birthplace of black civilization wandered, they found, almost without exception, people already settled, some having preceded them by decades or centuries, and others who had been there, according to their ancestors' story, since the beginning of time. Such, for example, was the tradition of the Keet and Siwa people in Central Africa. The intertribal wars and the intense tribalism that developed from them are among the fateful outcomes cited in connection with the migrations. I have stated a number of times that, inevitably, there were non-blacks in the migrations as they were, in one way or another, integrated with Africans and participated with them in other developments. This meant that there were always a number of predominantly black groups with some Asians and mulattoes who were as loyal to the race as any black. This is the kind of fact that blasts any attempt to indict a whole people or put them into a single category. Human beings simply refuse to be generalized into neat categories. So in ancient times, and even later, there were Caucasians who regarded the blacks as superior people, and the question about inherent equality they would have thought absurd to entertain. The Greeks, who seem to have studied the advanced civilization of the blacks more than any other white people, were first among this group. There were therefore always Caucasians who were affectionately drawn to the blacks as by some magic. When recognized as genuine by the blacks, the esteem became mutual, and such Caucasians became an integral part of some black groups. These were not the Caucasians, Asians or Western, who infiltrated black societies for domination and future conquests. These were the Caucasians, albeit a small minority, who stayed with the blacks and fought shoulder to shoulder with them against their own kind, retreated with them in defeat, and were therefore a part of the migrations. I have also emphasized that not all of the mixed breeds, whether Afro-Arab or Afro-European, deserted the blacks for the whites. For while the majority did cleave to the race of their fathers, the devotion of the minority to the race of their mothers seemed to be so spiritual in nature that it more than overshadowed the white-worshipping half-whites. White scholars as authorities. And what has all this to do with the migration? The answer is almost everything. Much of the history of Africa has been written by anthropologists. They have written it within the theoretical framework of their own ethnology, and historians and others have relied almost entirely on their classification of peoples. The usual claim that the discipline is a science is made despite the amount of pure guessing that characterizes its conclusions. Racism is so obvious in most of the anthropological findings that one may wonder how, if they hope to maintain the fiction of being scientific, it could escape their notice. It has been suggested that their bias does not in fact go unnoticed, but that they are so certain of the favorable reception by the white audience to which they address themselves that what others outside of that world think is a matter of little consequence. These latter do not supply the millions that support their African studies. The main thrust of their findings is to make Africa Caucasian from the beginning of its history, and to give blacks not just a subordinate role, but no significant role at all in that history. Hence their great emphasis on 1. The Caucasoid identity of this or that African tribe, and 2. Failing in that highly advanced all-black situation where no such classification could be made, to allege Caucasian influence in one way or another. This record does not require debate. It meets the eyes of most of the books by these Africanist experts. There should be no confusion over Negroid types or Caucasoid types where there was such a widespread mixing of races as was the case in Africa, as elsewhere, from the earliest times. It becomes even more ridiculous when it is established that certain Caucasians have Negroid features without the benefit of having any Negro blood, and, conversely, many of the blackest blacks have physical characteristics which are supposed to belong to Caucasians only. In line with their presumption in taking over the continent and reordering its racial composition, the anthropologists and their historian followers have declared that only the true Negroes, black Africans, are concentrated in West Africa only. With one wave of the magic wand in their all-powerful scientific hand, they have changed the biblical story so that the black race descended from Ham through his son Cush. The plain fact that the land of Cush was ancient Ethiopia itself, and that the Cushites, were blacks was simply ignored. And Cushites were reclassified as Caucasians. The whites and half-whites who were allied with black groups and migrated with them are singled out as the determining elements in whatever the groups achieved, even the planting of crops and irrigation techniques. The Asiatic Caucasians, who are known to have settled along the northern and eastern coasts of Africa, even in prehistoric times, are now being presented as the indigenous inhabitants. That archaeologists would find Caucasoid types centuries old in any of these areas should be taken as a simple matter of course. Nor would I think it surprising if excavations discovered Caucasoid skeletons several thousand years old anywhere in Africa. The same unshocked attitude is maintained when Negroid types were discovered on the British Isles, as indeed Negroid remains have been found in other places in Europe and distant lands where no blacks are known to have lived, not to mention the millions to have settled outside of Africa. Therefore, instead of postulating a theory of history that, on the basis of a few skeletal remains, a whole people inhabited an area first, it would be more sensible to conclude that members of this or that race certainly had visited or settled in the area in the long ago, some dying there, away from their own native land. But suppose they did come as permanent settlers, such as the Dutch in South Africa and the British in Rhodesia. The whites of South Africa are not waiting for the certain verdict of anthropologists and historians in their favor. They already claim to be the original inhabitants, saying, as George Peter Murdoch and his school proclaim, that the Africans came into the land later. 1,000 years hence, there will be no dearth of Caucasoid remains in Africa. I just referred to George Peter Murdoch. All through these discussions I have been unsparing in my criticism of Caucasoid scholarship at various points. I have, in effect, accused them of the subtle thievery of the achievements of an important division of the human race, deliberate and unconscionable. To understand the basis for this criticism, one need not match my labor by wading through over 100 books by them. One good example of all that I have been saying in this connection will suffice. That example is Murdoch's Africa, its peoples and their culture history. For here is another one of those works which is replete with all the trappings of profound scholarship, bearing, as all such works invariably do, the mark of scientific objectivity. Yet from beginning to end, Murdoch maintains his central theme. Africans are not in fact Africans. Black civilization was not in fact black civilization. Countless peoples thought to be Negroes by many, such as the Bushmen, the Maasai, the Kushites, Pygmies, and even the Bantu, etc., are of Caucasoid origins. And while his own account of migrations often contradicts his main thesis, this, I suppose, he dismisses as simply unavoidable. He was at his racist best in a specious and rather amusing argument that attempted to prove that even the Azanians were not black. Is it not significant that so many white writers spend so much time and energy trying to make this or that person or group non-African? Certain direct consequences of the migration will not be fully understood unless the many centuries they slowly covered are kept in mind. The development and spread of the numerous languages, dialects, separate and independent small city states from which varieties of culture patterns inevitably emerged, these outcomes highlight the factors of segmentation in the decline of advanced black institutions. But migrations from the first centers of black cultures in the Sudan and Egypt had beneficial results also. The migrants were a new kind of missionaries. They carried whatever they could of their advanced civilization wherever they went, and they carried it far and wide. The backward groups that had been living far away from the centers of progress were the beneficiaries. An economic revolution occurred in areas where the Nile migrants not only brought new grain crops, but also new implements and farming techniques. They also spread the gospel of industrial production through the expansion of crafts and their organization into guilds. The greatest of these was iron, for iron, all by itself, created the greatest industrial revolution in Africa and became at once both the catalyst and foundation of the new state formations and expansions of power. In like manner, basic African institutions, such as the traditional constitutional and social systems, were reinforced by the migrations from the heartland. And while many of these basic institutions were influenced and modified by Islam and Christian Europe, they all remain so unyielding at the core that they can be studied today almost as directly as they could have been 5,000 years ago. There is another fact in this connection that is not pointed out often and never stressed. We generally speak glibly enough about Asian and Western influence on Black Africa, but seldom about the influence of Africa on Asian and Western institutions. The process of Africanization began at once whenever and wherever the blacks came in contact with foreign institutions. Both Islam and Christianity had to yield to Africanization. Even autocratic sultans and emirs, all powerful in Asia, clashed head-on with the constitutional role of the council in Africa and had to yield. The religions that spread most rapidly and widely were those which were readily adaptable to African cultural patterns. Islam and the Catholic Church led in this, and the Catholic Church outdistanced every other Christian denomination in growth. A large volume should be written on the African influence on both Asian and Western civilization, since that influence began in ancient times, was not limited to Caucasians on the African continent, but was carried to other lands by migrating whites who themselves had been Africanized. African values did not die even among the millions of slaves who were transplanted in distant lands. In the United States, where the system to stamp out every vestige of black culture was the most thoroughgoing and relentless, African traditions persisted and influenced not only the white slave-owning class, but the course of American civilization itself. The historical significance of the movement of people, no matter under what circumstances, can hardly be overemphasized. We have seen how and why the flight of the blacks from the Sudan increased as the Arab hordes continued to sweep in during the 13th century and Islamization was more aggressively pushed. To many blacks leaving the homeland, what was happening was far worse than the sight of their cities, towns, and villages going up in flames. For now they saw their very own leaders, kings, and other notables, divesting themselves of a tradition of civilization that went back beyond history into Paleolithic times and, for expediency or self-interest, were humbly grasping at the robes of the Arabs, their language, and their religion. Their leaders on the throne were no longer Africans or Ethiopians. They were now of still another race. They were black Arabs. So it did not matter at all that the new states were forming under black Arab rule. The Arabs not only tolerated these black Muslim rulers, sultans and emirs they were now called, but found it expedient to use them as fronts in controlling the remaining black population. The real rulers were the various Arab tribes that were now scattered all over the Sudan. There was a great difference between these new black Muslim states and Funj, for while Funj was also sultanate in name, it had a long line of black rulers who steadfastly refused to be Arabized, even to the extent of accepting Arabic names, and even the Arab population knew very well that the Muslim religion of those black sultans was very superficial indeed. The new fringe states of Darfur, Wadai, and others under black Muslims offered no place of refuge for those whose very reason for flight was to maintain their own racial identity, dignity, and religion. The Saharan Tragedy. We return to the Sahara again, for here is where the first black migrations began before written history. Sahara or wasteland indicates what it became, not what it was. It was the largest northern region of Bilad al-Sudan, the land of the blacks. Viewing this vast area for at least 5,000 years, it is difficult to believe that it was not forever thus. But the Sahara, far bigger than the United States, was once a land of lakes, rivers, forests, green fields, farms, villages, towns, and cities. Wildlife was abundant. Cattle grazed in meadows, and horse-drawn chariots sped over the highways. It was a great land, yet only part of an even greater black world. We have already noted that this black African world had been under relentless pressures from the seacoasts by invading whites from the earliest times. Canaanites, Hebrews, Phoenicians, Mongols, Arabs, Berbers, Greeks, Romans, et al. It was also pointed out that it is not without significance that even today, most of the invaders occupy the same areas where they first came in, the seacoasts. For centuries, these whites must have been received with the traditional African hospitality. They were immigrants, settlers, and traders. Many, like the early blacks themselves, were seafaring men. That the blacks were once among the most adventurous of peoples is evidenced not only by the presence of their descendants in many lands and numerous far-flung islands, but also by archaeological remains found in various parts of Europe. It seems clear, therefore, that the whites were not regarded as invaders with ulterior motives, but as co-partners in the further development of world trade. There was no obvious reason to think otherwise. No particular significance was seen in the fact that the whites always massed along the seacoasts and built their own towns and trading post strongholds there. The blacks were also in these same coastal areas. There was a general mixing or amalgamation of the races, also from the earliest times. In this area, the offsprings of blacks and white Berbers and Arabs became known as Moors, Tuaregs, Tipu, and the Fulani. Like Afro-Americans, they were of every conceivable complexion, some of the whitest having Negro blood. The scientists on Africa, however, classify even the dark-skinned in these groups as Caucasoid. It does not appear that any black prophets came forth to warn the trusting African people that over 3 million square miles of their fertile land would be made a vast wasteland by the slowly moving sandstorms from the north, or that, even fleeing, their very lives would likewise be made a vast wasteland by the white storms from the seacoast. The sandstorms at first began their long and relentless rampage over hundreds of miles, but only as previous deforesting and the disappearance of grassland made this easy. The desiccation began far back in time, probably during a period well after Quaternary times began. No one knows how long that awful process of drying up lakes and rivers lasted. What is crystal clear is that during the ensuing migrations, the blacks made their greatest and most tragic error. It was an error to be fraught with the direst historical consequences for the whole black race. Instead of moving en masse to the seacoasts and maintaining the dominant position there, which they could have done easily, they moved en masse toward the interior, first to the remaining oases in the desert, and then into northern and southern Ethiopia, Egypt, and the Sudan, and to the south, central, and western regions. The Berbers, Arabs, and their Afro-Asian offsprings, Moors, Tuaregs, etc., now held firmly the entire northern, northwestern, and eastern seaboard of Africa. This tremendous victory of the white man was not achieved by conquest. It was achieved by default on the part of a race too preoccupied with the immediate present and less with its future, and a race whose centuries of blind trust in the white man passes all understanding. One might say that in surrendering all of their coastal areas to the Asians and mulattoes, and apparently without a fight except in the case of Lower Egypt, that the blacks not only sealed themselves off from the world of commerce and all general international relations, but they also, and at the same time, sealed their own fate to be a surrounded, hemmed-in hunting ground for slaves. The pattern for Egypt and Axum was clear-cut. Their story was already outlined early enough and so clearly that even the blind could not be unaware of the shape of things to come. The shape emerged in their present. The whites were aggressive, always relentlessly pushing for the command position in every situation, no matter how small their number or how insignificant the project. The blacks, by contrast, are not so aggressive, tend toward the brotherhood approach, and generally strike only in retaliation for prior wrongs done. This overall humane and essentially religious attitude of the blacks led Arnold Toynbee to say that mankind may have to emulate them if civilization is to be saved. This is hardly a compliment in a world where the very meaning of civilization is lost. In the face of the Caucasian will to power and domination, this religion of meekness is a tacit surrender to the permanent overlordship of the aggressive and the strong. This is the testimony of history. And perhaps this is why I have always been puzzled by the declaration of Jesus Christ that the meek would inherit the earth. Did he mean the grave? The pattern referred to above developed from the fact that countless thousands of blacks did not migrate anywhere but remained among the Asians. They gradually became the lowest class in the society, although there was some mobility or escape routes. The Berbers and Arabs constituted the upper class and ruling group. Next came the Afro-Berbers and Afro-Arabs, mulattoes, also classified as white, but in a class below whites. And finally, there were the still lower class of blacks, and strangely enough, all Berbers, Arabs, and mixed breeds who chose to cast their lot with the blacks and share their destiny. I said strangely enough, but there was really nothing strange about it. It was simply a human situation. A part of the explanation was that out of centuries of intermarriages, there had developed a network of family and kinship relationships. But it meant much more than these kinship ties. These whites and half-whites, admittedly a small minority, nevertheless did not have to have themselves classified as blacks, giving up the open opportunity to direct power, fame, and fortune. Like a majority of whites and half-whites with similar ties to the blacks, they could have easily cut those ties and even denied that any ties ever existed. That was the easy way, the self-serving and expedient way. They refused to take it and chose to share all the hardships of the blacks. I dwell on this because here we catch a fleeting glimpse of the progress of human spirit as it emerged on a plane above the rewards of materialism and self-interest. I dwell on it because wherever this small group exists in a world gone mad with greed, there will remain some faint hope for a more humane world in the next 1,000 years. Social and economic mobility came from the circumstances that the blacks made up the strongest contingents of the Berber and Arab armies. Some became commanders, others became chief counselors to sultans. Most males were castrated, however, or removed from possible contact with all females. An equally significant group was the labor force of enslaved blacks. These were highly important because they relieved the white Asians from all labor. The blacks who were skilled craftsmen in various fields fared better since they were generally spared from the whip. The plight of the blacks in white-dominated areas, including their enslavement, would have been different if the masses had not scattered in small groups over the trackless Sahara, the Nile Valley, Ethiopia, and other regions of the continent. The others referred to were the blacks who remained where they were as their once vast and fertile homeland slowly turned into a Sahara or wasteland. Geologists, archaeologists, and other specialists have all advanced various theories to explain the great mystery of the transforming Sahara. We need not retell their interesting story here, for every explanation seems to project still another puzzling question, for me at any rate. For example, just how did the Albion Sea, a vast inland body of water as large as France, disappear in the Sahara? How many cities and towns lie buried under those mountains of sand and rocks? We know that in a given area, all farms, orchards, and even villages could be completely covered over with sand in a matter of weeks. The fierce winds whipped up walls of sand and gravel like mountainous ocean waves. Since this region is over 1,000 miles wide and more than 3,000 miles from east to west, most of the people in the interior must have perished with their villages, farms, lakes, and rivers. The exceptions were those lucky people whose farms and villages escaped inundation by the moving oceans of sand. In these places of refuge, later called oases, the otherwise indiscriminate forces of death and destruction did indeed discriminate. Sometimes high walls of sand began to pile up just before reaching these sites, leaving them safely in the valleys thus formed. These continued to be the centers of life and hope as the years passed on into our own times. And it is not without significance that 2/3 of the Sahara population today is still black. Like their ancestors, they continue to be settled communities of farmers and craftsmen, the kind of communities where civilization itself is born. But also like their ancestors and all other advancing peoples, they were vulnerable to the widely ranging camel-riding Berber and Arab nomads. These tent-dwelling raiders gained absolute control of all the trans-Saharan trade routes. With their kinsmen in control of all the commercial seaports, they had effective control over the economic life of Africa, and therefore Africa itself. The matter of making that control more complete by raiding and enslaving the blacks in scattered oasis communities became relatively easy. Direct contacts with Europe and Asia meant the possession of the latest superior weapons which the blacks were unable to secure: firearms. Ethnology and the migrations. The great story of the Sahara is yet to be told. Archaeology has hardly scratched the surface beneath which a lost civilization lies buried under several thousand feet of sand and rocks. How far westward did the effective rule of the ancient empire extend? How many kingdoms were there, and by what African names were they known? Were the fringe states, such as ancient Ghana, that were found fighting for survival on the edges of the desert, once a part of a vast imperial system? There is some evidence that this may have been the case, but the actual fact remains unknown and speculation becomes an idle pastime. What is known is that the migrations from the Sahara, while heavily concentrated in Upper Egypt and the Eastern Sudan, also spread out over Africa in and through the Western Sudan. I may seem to have overemphasized the ethnic composition of some migrating groups by repeating reference to it, but it is so important that white historians have bypassed it in order to establish a new theory of prehistoric Caucasian occupation of Africa. Have they not found supposedly Caucasoid remains and artifacts in different places? According to this theory, the whites, in their conquest of Africa, were simply returning to their own original homeland. But where now is the homeland of the blacks? Our Africanist experts do not know. Some few, apparently seeing how ridiculous was the corner into which they had painted themselves, suggest that perhaps the blacks migrated from India or somewhere in Europe. Others undertake to establish Caucasian priority in Africa by excavating structures which no Negroes could have built. An example is a prehistoric site in Uganda. They found what seems to have been a well-built fortification of earthwork, reservoirs, dams for irrigation, trenches, and pit dwellings. All this indicated the mass organization and skills of a superior people, such as the Sidamo, for example. Nowhere in East Africa, the author concludes, are Negro peoples, either Bantu or Nilotic, known to have built structures even remotely comparable to these. This, like 1,000 similar false statements about Africans, requires no answer. The facts now are well known. But let us not miss the central point in all this. The Sidamo people, cited by this anthropologist as the probable builders of those structures, are themselves black Africans, as black and as African as are the anthropologists' Bantu and Nilotic groups. I have lived among all three groups. Some of the people in each group are of mixed blood as a simple matter of course, just as American blacks are mixed. But in their pathological drive to prevent any concepts of unity from emerging in Africa, Caucasian scholars have been relentless in dividing the blacks of Africa into numerous ethnic categories. This grand strategy was designed to make each group feel unique, special, and hostile to all other groups. The development of different languages in the scattered and isolated societies was the most favorable situation for the division of blacks and the furtherance of hostility among them. None of this was evil deliberately designed. The writing of the history, or rather non-history, of non-Caucasians from a Caucasian viewpoint was a development of relatively recent times. It followed logically from the 19th century theories of social evolution. Racism, the natural byproduct, now had a scientific basis, and as such became an integral part of education itself. This is why Western anthropologists have played the dominant role in shaping African history, which, from their viewpoint, was the study of primitive peoples. The migrations, as we have seen, served their purpose well. The imperialists with the pen. The picture becomes clear, however, when we know that the black migrations were not always all black. Some of these were Afro-Asians, some had a few white Asians, other groups were entirely Afro-Berber or Afro-Arab. These often tended to form an independent ethnic group, keeping to themselves. There were also some groups of Berbers and later Arabs who migrated from the Sahara to favorable locations in the interior. So as stated above, since we are here considering the earliest migrations from the Sahara, to find Caucasoid remains in any part of Africa today is really without any particular significance. Such finds obviously do not justify the conclusions reached by many writers. But these experts on Africa are not ignorant of the essential facts and outcomes of migrations. This is certainly true of those who have studied the dispersions and the mixing of peoples over the millenniums. They know, but there is apparently a deeply felt need, an urgent and almost desperate compulsion to justify the power position of the white world over the non-white peoples. That white power is so all-encompassing that the task of Western scholarship, in particular, is easy enough. First of all, they are not only supported by the almost limitless wealth amassed from the exploited peoples of the earth, but they also still control, directly or indirectly, the economic life of every black state today. This is equally true of numerous non-African countries, still poor and begging, while their wealth is being drained off to the already rich countries. Secondly, they control world education and science. Scholarship, supported by millions of dollars, far from being independent and objective, has generally served its masters well, becoming arrogant and overbearing in the process. Their most powerful weapon is a single word: science. Having successfully raised science far above religion in the faith of people generally, they may now present almost any proposition or conclusion as scientific and gain wide acceptance. The age has passed when men listened with reverence when it was declared, "Thus saith the Lord." Now one simply has to say, "According to science," or "Most scholars are agreed," etc. Finally, the universities spearheaded the final economic triumph of the West over the rest of the world. Science pushed the partnership of big corporate wealth and big government into existing fields of inventions and discoveries. Weapons of universal destruction actually outdistanced the technology of time and space. Who, then, could question white supremacy? Who dared to challenge viewpoints held by scholars with this awesome array of power behind them? Certainly nothing coming from the blacks required any serious consideration. The mind transplant had been most successful as an operation on the blacks. Having lost the honor of full manhood that comes only from the pride of racial worth and identity, the black man's mind generally operates favorably towards his white enemies and negatively toward himself and his kind. No one knows this better than the whites. They have, therefore, had a free and unchallenged hand in reordering the land of the blacks as they saw fit, classifying and naming people, places, and things just as they pleased. The blacks were non-persons or nobodies in their own land. From one end of the continent to the other, black youth saw great monuments and statues of Europeans only, European and Arab names for African roads, hills, lakes, towns, and cities. One youngster, whose ancestors had migrated from the north centuries ago, stood gazing at a statue of Cecil Rhodes. "He's in our school books too," he proudly informed his parents. That smile left as he asked, "But why are our great men forgotten? We never hear about them." As none could answer, there was silence. This particular group belonged to a family that was 2,000 miles from the known original home. This refers to the place that oral tradition declares to be the original home. But we know that the place of origin, often given in the oral record, means the place where the group lived for so many generations that previous home sites during these long drawn-out migrations had been forgotten. What they had forgotten, however, was less tragic than their ignorance of some of the well-known facts of their more recent history as a people. The boy had raised important questions. They could not answer because they are blacks of Rhodesia. What little history they knew was white Rhodesian history, and this they could learn from Rhodes to Ian Smith. They did not know that they had been living for generations in the center of what was once one of the greatest black empires in Africa, nor had they ever heard of the great African leader of that empire, Emperor Mutata. As elsewhere, Rhodesian history began with the coming of the whites. All before that is unknown history. To the caves, to the swamps. We have been studying those people who were actually migrating from highly advanced civilization to less advanced regions or regions not advanced at all, but who continued to rebuild new states until they were destroyed by the European invasions. Since a representative number of these states appear in the following pages, a final word should be said about the vast numbers who found only caves and swamps as places of refuge, and therefore built no states, but sank lower and lower in hopelessness, ever-present fears of capture, and a life that was not life, but an animal-like struggle to survive. I referred to these before, but all too briefly. They are an inseparable part of the history of the race. Their savage state enabled us to measure the distance from the heights to the level where so many of the race had fallen. It also may be the bold recognition on our part that serves as a guidelight on the road back to greatness. Call them savages if that pleases you, but these were the blacks in retreat before the slave hunters. These were the blacks who had to choose between enslavement for life and that of all of their descendants and freedom. They did not hesitate. They chose freedom even though it meant the loss of civilization, a civilization which they had, in fact, already lost. To be slaves of Arabs, Europeans, or Americans simply meant becoming the economic foundation of their civilization and the steady destruction of the civilization of the blacks. So, all hail to the black savages, these noble ancestors who chose both freedom and death in preference to white enslavement. Freedom and death. Once the paths they made in flight could be followed for days by their bloody footprints in the sand. The wind-blown sand had easily covered these up. Later travelers and slave hunters could determine the various routes of flight by the skeletons found here and there, fallen statues left by those who could not make it on. They were generally disjointed and scattered. Sometimes it was a bony arm protruding from the windswept sands, a leg over there, or a skull seeming to smile, peace at last. The bones of over thousands who died in flight were never seen. They lay buried forever under the tons of sand and rocks that moved over much of the regions. Masses of blacks found security in hills that were made inaccessible to both Arabs and Europeans. Such were blacks who isolated themselves in the strongholds of the Nuba Hills. They were never conquered, throwing back all invading army units that attempted subjugation and enslavement. Westerners point to their primitive state, to their nude and half-nude bodies. To the somewhat twisted Western mind, nakedness in public is indicative of the savage. The twisted mind becomes more evident when the same people do not find it necessary to explain the universality of white nudist colonies or naked bodies, not to mention sexual intercourse on public stages and screens. Reference to the Noba people, of course, is simply to give still another example of a people who had to make the grim choice between freedom and slavery, and chose freedom even when that choice meant isolation and inevitably retrogression. Blacks who were among the very first weavers and clothmakers on Earth could no longer wear clothes. These flights before the mighty firepower of the invaders became more general after 1400 AD, even though guns, after 200 years of development, were still not in widespread use in Africa. Only Europeans and Arabs were able to secure a limited supply of these precious and certain-to-conquer weapons. The blacks had nothing of the kind. Meanwhile, experimentation to improve various types of gunnery and speed up production was frantically pushed. The successful outcome of this great venture in firepower was the prelude to the Industrial Revolution that was to change not only the material world, but what was left of the humane nature of man himself. It is not likely that the people were then generally aware that they were being slowly hemmed in from all directions. It is possible that many did feel it, without having any exact knowledge of being encircled, although the danger might be several hundred miles away where the hostile seas met the friendly land. So other groups of wandering blacks headed for dismal swamps, still others dug caves in hillsides. There were those who wandered aimlessly out into the scorching desert and died with their babies strapped to their backs and larger children clutched by their hands. This means that the bleached skeletons of little babies and children also greeted the eyes as though additional testimony was needed to show how many of the young were included among those who could not make it even to barbarism. All of those who survived in these various groups ended up in areas where they could do little more than survive. Even if they had not splintered off into small independent societies, famine and disease would have reduced their numbers anyway. Therefore, as noted elsewhere, there were many firmly united groups that were so large that migrating as a single unit was impossible. Here, the very circumstances of the case demanded separation, estrangement, and isolation from the mother society, and the eventual development of several new language groups. The disunity among the blacks that spread over the whole race often developed from crisis situations over which they had no control in the awful struggle to survive. The millions who found security only in places of extreme isolation, in caves, swamps, around a few precious waterholes in the desert, and on inaccessible hills, none of these people were favored with the chance to even begin the building of their lost civilization. Far from being ashamed of them as savages, this chapter is a salute to them, a salute with pride that says to them, all honor and all glory. Unlike the blacks we know most about, they could not build great kingdoms and empires. Many were far removed even from the fringes of an advancing world, yet they overrode the unceasing attacks of both death and hell and survived. What is more, they held the fast lane of freedom on the African continent, and they held it against cannon fire to the very end. Even when colonialism swept over their land, they were never conquered. They had been wise enough to see both Islam and Christianity as just another route to the slavery they had fought and died to avoid, so they remained steadfast in their own religion and therefore were called pagans. But all of their children were born free, none in Muslim or Christian slavery, and their girls were never dragged off to become slaves in the harems of Arabes or as breeding girls for white men in the West. Finally, I referred to blacks who, though forced to move, never left their homeland region. The Noba did not move very far from where they had lived from times immemorial. A far greater number of blacks held on in their ancient center after it was overrun, refusing either to leave or be enslaved. They stayed and battled against the invaders, finally being concentrated in the southern provinces of the Sudan, where the earlier history of the race in Egypt is still being repeated line by line. And this is why it is so easy to understand the history of the blacks and see very clearly how they were not only forced far back behind the advancing races, but also pushed to the lowest levels of degradation. For that history is still being made today, covertly and openly, for all the world to see. The blacks who are under pressure today in Bahr el-Ghazal, Upper Nile, and Equatoria are still fighting for survival against the all-conquering colored Arabs, just as their forefathers fought 5,000 years ago from the Mediterranean in Lower Egypt to where they are now making a last stand. Romantic history? Who needs it? They have been massacred by the hundreds and villages left in ashes, but they fight on. This all-black region is kept isolated and cut off from the developments and all of the higher levels of life seen in the Arab-dominated Sudan. So these southern Sudanese remain, even in 1973, both primitive and pagan, just as their brothers elsewhere had to remain under similar circumstances. It was still the hunting ground for slaves. The blacks had to remain sharply alert at all times, for the modern slave traffic is covert, subtle, and often highly sophisticated. There are no outright raids. The slave agents may appear as employment officers seeking workers, or representatives of school offering free training for nurses, teachers, and various trades. I was told when I was working in this area that these tactics were successful for a long time because of the extreme poverty and the desperate need for jobs. The fighting that has been going on constantly for 15 years has caused the same kind of migrations as most of those already described. Thousands have been migrating into any country that allows them to enter. Even in this modern age, many will never see those left behind again. They will scatter and settle among other people wherever they can. They will become lost in the merger, while their brothers and sisters stay behind and carry on the ancient tradition of fighting on against overwhelming odds as long as they can stand. In this study, you must have noticed that the past and present are joined. We study our past for the express purpose of learning what things made the race great in the past, what explains subsequent failures and weakness, and what, in the light of that history, we can do now if we have the will. This is what the study of history should mean for African people in particular. This chapter on the migrations, for example, tells us much that is even alarmingly crucial. But how many of us care to grapple with its real significance? Who asks why is it that the black world, forever uptight over South Africa and Rhodesia, has remained silent about the 15 years of the slaughter of blacks in the Sudan? I asked 4 leaders of the resistance if the southern provinces had ever appealed to the Organization of African Unity for help. We have been begging them ever since it started, was the unanimous reply. Not for arms, but just to use its influence to stop the burning of our villages and the massacre of our people. But you see, the white and brown Arabs actually control the policies of the OAU. For us, that means that they still control the blacks of Africa. Meanwhile, migrants still wander as of old. For them, freedom and independence are yet to come to Africa.
Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.